Hi there, everybody. Here I am once again, Vincent Rogers. Don't even know my own name, you know. Get a little old, it gets kind of funny. Anyway, I'm here today to talk about a very, very colorful career of a woman. In her lifetime, she was big. I mean, in the 1920s, there were people like, say, Lindbergh. But this lady was right up there with them, all the biggies. Her name was Aimee Semple McPherson. Quite a mouthful. Let me get acquainted with the lady. I'm going to step out of the shot here and let you look at some of the stuff that's up here in the background. Starting here over to the far left. There's Mrs. McPherson at about age, I don't know, around 45 or so. And in the background, you see her enormous temple, the Angelus Temple in Los Angeles. We'll talk about that directly. Here's a picture of her, next in order. One of her, rather, the perpetual virgin, don't you know? There she is. And somewhat soupy pose with enough roses to sink a ship. And then next in line, reminder of her many talents. She wrote all her own music for her revival meetings and so forth, and published them under her own label, and of course sold them, and sold the rights and so forth. She had many schemes for making money. And now here is a picture. Now this is a little, I've been hard put to get you a good picture of the Angelus Temple. We'll have more to say about it directly, but in any case, this is something that could contain 5,400 worshipers, built in 1921, and it's just huge. It's still down there. You can see it if you go to Los Angeles. And finally, here's a book that remains the most, undoubtedly the most important book ever written on Aimee, by Lately Thomas. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but in any case, you probably can get it through Amazon. Well, that's enough to get us started. Aimee was born in 1890. I'll give you some idea. I'm 88. My father was born in 1890. To give you some, it was almost as if she was the same age as my mother, so to speak. Give you some idea of trying to place her. She was born in Canada, in Ontario. Her mother was widowed early on. The mother was in Salvation Army work, and she was very anxious for her daughter to become what they call a lassie. That was the expression for Salvation Army workers, for the young women. And but it turned out even better than Ma Kennedy. That was her name, was Kennedy. Ma Kennedy. She was very fortunate in the sense that Aimee took to it like a fish. She goes for water. I mean, as a child, she'd get a tin, maybe a coffee can or something like that, go beating on it with sticks and stuff like that, singing hymns to heaven and all the rest of it, as a child. And even through her adolescence, she only became more and more intense in her religious conviction. But she disappointed Ma in this respect. She fell in with the Pentecostals. Excuse me. Pentecostals, you know, are the ones who are rather enthusiastic, to say the least, about their worship. They fall down in faints and they gibberish, which, well, I shouldn't have said that because it's glossolalia. You see, the Holy Spirit descends, and even though these noises are not intelligible to the ordinary person, they're very meaningful in other regards. So she fell in with that sort of thing. It was there that she met a young man, Robert Semple. Mr. Semple was by day a boilermaker, at night a preacher. They both fell in love, and though Ma wasn't crazy about the idea of her daughter being involved so soon, they were married in 1908. And hardly married, they got on a boat and went to China to do missionary work. It was one of these impulsive things that overtakes these people. I mean, they ill-equipped what they were going to do. She got pregnant while in China, and of course Robert Semple, the Reverend Semple, got himself malaria and died, And here's Aimee in China with a child. Well, fellow missionaries were kind enough to get her back to the United States. And here she is, a widow at a very young age. And with very little prospect, she goes to New England. Her mother, Ma Kennedy, comes down from Canada to help her out. And what do? They get on the mission trail in the East Coast. And it's there that Aimee met a gentleman by the name of McPherson. And Mr. McPherson was a God-fearing man, but he wasn't all that holy, you know, just out of his head holy. But they were married, and Aimee wanted him to join them in the mission field, and he tried to do it, but he wasn't any good at it, and wasn't much good at anything, basically. And so Ma and Aimee dumped him. I mean, they just literally dumped the poor guy so that they could go on with the mission work. The interesting thing about it is that years later, Mr. McPherson, I think it was in the early 30s or late 20s, he turned around and sued Aimee for a divorce on the grounds of desertion. It's usually the woman that does that. He did it, and he won. So she was, it was a very bad publicity for her. I want to show you here a picture that, this gives you some idea of Aimee's early work. This is a Packard automobile, pretty high-class thing. Where she got the money for it, I can't imagine. Anyway, you can see there, he said, join the Army, something like that, God is coming soon, or whatever. And here she is, and of course you take the top off that automobile, and she'd stand up there, and that's how she did it at first, just on corners, street corners and so forth. Now, it was very unusual in those days for a woman to be preaching. And so it was certainly a novelty, but more than that, it was thought to be as something of a scandal because, you see, from the Christian point of view, St. Paul had said, you know, women, you get to the back of the church, just be silent. So this was against God's command, or people inferred that she had no business doing this sort of thing. But she and Ma, nevertheless, kept at it, and the crowds began to grow, and pretty soon it was no longer this automobile, it was a tent, and pretty soon it was more than the tent. It was the civic auditorium in these seats, in these cities that they'd go to. More and more money is pouring in. I mean, the woman is absolutely dynamic. And she is making many, many friends, but she's also making many, many enemies, mostly church people. They didn't like the idea of somebody coming from out of town and sucking all the oxygen, and I might add, all the dough. They didn't care for that. Aren't they Christian, aren't they? Well, anyway, Aimee kept at it. Now, I want to emphasize something here. As this grows, of course, then there's more and more people involved in, you know, advanced people and people making the arrangements, this, that, and the other. And where money is concerned, and it's easy money, you get a lot of deadbeats. Ma Kennedy herself was very good at spotting the deadbeats, the hangers-on, what we'd call groupies now, or all this sort of thing. Ma'd get rid of them right away. And so the money was, they kept a pretty good, tight on the money. And thus it proceeded. They came out west, and that did it. They liked Los Angeles, they liked the weather. Crowds were huge. Los Angeles, you know, was more receptive to a lot of this kind of thing than any other part of the United States, largely because, I don't know, just Los Angeles is just kind of crazy. That's what it amounts to. So they had determined that would be their base. In 1921, they were in San Diego, which is now just a 2-hour drive from LA. And Sunday, they were going to have a revival thing in the Balboa Park, which is there in San Diego, in the Speckles Organ Pavilion. It's a great, huge area. And Aimee, before the services, she had airplanes going and dropping leaflets all over San Diego. And the consequence was, and the police department confirmed this, that there's a crowd of 30,000 people came to see the service. Well, I don't know how much they could see, but they must have been miles away from the service itself. But from the service itself, Aimee started to do some faith healing. Crutches were flying through the air. Wheelchairs were being abandoned. It was absolutely incredible stuff. Well, from this distance, you know, we look at it in a rather different way, I think. First of all, we're talking about 1921. People come along, say something like the following. I have cancer. Well, how do you know you have cancer? Well, because my sister had cancer, and she had exactly the same symptoms that I'm having right now, so therefore I have cancer. Well, I mean, Sister Aimee can cure that easily enough. Just pray over and that gets rid of it, you see. And another thing is that in those days, there were licensing of doctors wasn't quite as good as it is nowadays. And there were just endless number of quacks. Add to that hysterical people and, of course, malingerers, people who just go there for the fun of it and get cured. So that answers to a lot of it. But Aimee, at least at this junction in her life, I think she was probably confused. She couldn't quite understand what was happening with all these people being cured. So it was, at least at first, it was a guiding thing for her. She honestly believed she was doing some sort of good. After this tremendous success in San Diego, they now concentrated on Los Angeles, and they found an area that was, they had an eye on a place in Echo Park. You can go down there, it's still there, this thing. There was this area in Echo Park, it was right outside of a lake. A beautiful boulevard passed by, and here was all this open land. And Aimee and Ma Kennedy, they wanted to get it. It wasn't for sale, but the owners found out that it was Sister Aimee Semple McPherson who wanted this property. Well, what they could do, what else could they do? They're good Christians, they just almost gave it to her. So for $5,000, they got this huge piece of prime property and immediately started the drive to build a temple, the Angelus Temple. And that was in 1921. By 1923, they had dedicated the temple, and it was ready to go. It could accommodate 5,400 people. It was simply enormous. It was the biggest thing. The dome on the thing alone was said to have been the largest dome construction at that time. The services were almost continuous, almost day long into the night. It was an operation, of course, had to be paid for. So Ma and Aimee are once again, they're out on the mission trail going all over the United States trying to raise money, coming back to LA, trying to, you know, fire up the crowds once again. And this is the kind of life that they led. And they did some very, very important work of a social nature in LA County. And I want to tell you about that, but I want to hold back on it, except to say that it was very, very good stuff, basically. And we'll hold that thought for a second posting we'll be doing. Now, to give you an idea of this woman's genius, she just knew publicity was like, she was just amazing with the stuff she would do. She had the third license issued, radio license issued in Los Angeles County in the year 1924. And she built a radio station right there in this huge temple. It was a Rolls Royce of broadcasting, had a strong signal that could be heard over large parts of all over Southern California. And once again, all these sermons and everything else and pleading for money. Can you imagine how this suddenly, just almost exponentially, the possibility for getting money is just enormous just because of the radio. And she had something that was very valuable too, and that was a radio engineer who knew what he was doing. Very few people knew much about radio engineering in those days. His name was Kenneth Ormiston. Well, everything seemed to be clicking along just fine, and then a strange thing happened. She seemed to change in some way. That the people in the temple realized that she was more bubbly and so forth, and she was often overheard with Kenneth Ormiston, the radio engineer, and they were making jokes, and she was laughing in a way that was kind of, they thought it was rather scandalous and so forth. I think it was in May of 1926, sometime along there. She went out to Ocean Beach to swim. It was near Venice, California. And she went out to the, she was a very good swimmer, and she went out into the surf swimming. And there was a secretary who had accompanied her and who was sitting in a deck chair or something like that, waiting for her sister to complete the swim, and then they would go back to the temple. And the secretary became concerned because Aimee was taking an awful long time with this swim. And now the secretary is really concerned. She talks to lifeguards, and people are going out looking for Aimee, and they're not finding Aimee. And so finally the secretary goes back to the temple with the bad news. Of course, now the news is getting all over the place. And Ma Kennedy is told that the sister has disappeared. That evening, Ma Kennedy goes before the congregation to say that Sister Aimee is with Jesus. Jesus has called her, and she is now with Jesus. Oh, you can imagine the wailing and all the rest of it. People just out of their gourd. I mean, Sister Aimee dead. No, no. Well, the time goes on, and still there's not even a body found. Nothing is happening. The time is going. Several weeks later comes a ransom demand. A letter to Ma Kennedy, which she shares with the public and the authorities. Excuse me. The thing is pages long. Well, you don't write ransom notes that are pages long. You cut them out of newspapers, you pay so much or I kill her, that kind. No, this thing goes on pages. And one of the things it threatened was that unless $500,000 was paid to the kidnappers, they would sell Aimee into sex slavery in Mexico. Well, you know, up to this point, I think undoubtedly that Ma Kennedy probably truly believed that Aimee was dead, that she had drowned. At this point, I think that Ma Kennedy had an inspiration, yeah, anything like selling Aimee into sex slavery. Of course, Aimee had written this letter, you know, that somebody else had used the penmanship to get it through. But even before this time, the press in those days was very, where gossip was concerned, this kind of gossip was just the, you know, the lifeblood of the Hearst press, of course. The press is asking, wait a minute. If Aimee's gone, where is Kenneth Ormiston? Ormiston had disappeared. So now they start to look for Ormiston, which is that now, you know, how, this is good paperwork, good reporting. And of course they find him. He's been all the while up around, believe it or not, Carmel, California. And it is there that they find all the evidence needed to show that they were in a love nest. Well, while all this is going on, then suddenly in early June 1926, Aimee appears in Douglas, Arizona. She has crossed the border. Her story is that she was kidnapped, that she was dragged 20 miles below the border, that she was kept in a shack by these strange people, and that they treated her with, but she was tied up all the while. And the way that she was able to escape was that she took a tin can and was able to use the sharp edge to cut the ropes that bound her. And she made the escape when they weren't looking, sort of thing. She is supposed to have crossed the desert, a 20-mile desert, to Douglas, Arizona. But her appearance was such, she was wearing a dress and a corset. Well, the last time she was seen, she was in a bathing suit. Where'd all this come from? She was wearing a wristwatch that would have been very prominent. I think it may be given to her by her mother, but in any case, she wasn't wearing that swimming, obviously, but now she had a wristwatch. Her shoes showed not the desert dust or wear, but rather green soiled with grass. So it was just one thing after another. It was completely phony. Well, she returns to California in triumph. Are you ready for this? On a railroad, Douglas, I guess the Southern Pacific Sunset Limited comes through Douglas. Anyway, she comes into Los Angeles, huge crowds. Of course, they just simply will not believe anything that against Sister Aimee. They simply won't do it. Well, The district attorney was put to a difficult situation here. Asa Keys was his name. Not a very good man at the work he was doing. Most L.A. Have you ever noticed that L.A. always has district attorneys that don't know what the hell they're doing? It seems to me it kind of goes with the job, I guess. Anyway, he reluctantly brought charges against Aimee for obstruction of justice and for all of this phoniness. And I'm going to tell you about the outcome of those trials, and that'll be for another posting. Join me then. It's exciting, isn't it, folks?